Good morning everybody, I'm Belinda and today I'll be interviewing World War I veteran Corporal George Julian Howell. Mr. Howell fought in World War I in the Battle of Gallipoli and the Battle of Poitiers. He was awarded the Victoria's Cross and is regarded as one of Australia's finest war heroes. It's a privilege to be able to interview him today. Please welcome him.
Yeah, thanks. Good morning. It's my pleasure to be here.
Great, let's get started with the interview. So, what was your life like before World War I?
I was born on the 19th of November 1893 in Enfield, New South Wales. My father is Francis John Howell and my mother is Martha. I've got 4 older brothers. I was educated at Croydon School and Burwood Public School before I became an apprentice at a bricklayers. Before I enlisted in the army, I worked as a builder in Sydney. I never pictured myself as someone who'd go to war, but then again, I don't think any of us did. But we all enlisted anyway, no idea what we were going into.
Wow, that's really interesting. So when did you enlist in the war?
I enlisted in the Australian Imperial Force on the 3rd of June 1915. Prior to this, I was unable to enlist because of enlistment requirements. To enlist in August in 1914, men had to be 19 to 38 years of age, a height of 5'6" and chest measurements of 34 inches. I fell just short of this, only 5'5", and my chest only measuring 33 inches. They relaxed these standards in June 1915, which is when I enlisted. During the first year of World War I, over 33% of volunteers were rejected. When more men were needed in the army in 1917, the standards were again lowered to 18 to 45 years of age and 5 foot tall. This meant many men who had previously not been able to enlist were now able to.
Wow, that really shows how desperate Australia was for manpower towards the end of the war. So, after you enlisted, what was your involvement in the war?
I was part of the 7th Reinforcements of the 1st Australian Infantry Battalion. I departed for overseas service on the 14th of June 1915 aboard the A67 HMAT or Silver. We arrived at Gallipoli on November 1st, 1915, where we joined the Anzac forces fighting the Ottoman Empire. I fought there until the evacuation of Gallipoli on the 20th of December 1916. A notable engagement at Gallipoli was the Battle of the Lone Pine in August, which I was involved in. After the withdrawal from Gallipoli in December 1915, my battalion returned to Egypt for further training. In March 1916, we sailed for France in the Western Front, where we engaged in more combat. During the fighting at Poitiers in July 1916, I was wounded in action and evacuated to a hospital in Sheffield, England, until I recovered from my injuries. From then until 1918, my battalion took part in operations around the German army, principally in the Somme Valley in France and around Ypres in Belgium.
Your involvement in war is commendable. You talked about being a part of the Gallipoli retrieval. As many of our viewers know, even 100 years later, Australians rejoice and celebrate the Gallipoli battles. It is arguably one of the most well-known and highly considered combats the Anzacs were ever involved in, even though it was a loss to the Allied forces. Mr. Howell, why do you think the Gallipoli battles were considered such a huge success?
I think Australians consider Gallipoli a proud moment in our nation's history because the evacuation was so successful. The landing, however, was not. I was not personally involved with the Gallipoli landing, but it resulted in huge Anzac casualties. Our forces didn't land in the right spot on the beach, so instead of encountering an easily accessible way to the trenches, they encountered high cliffs and mountains, which they had to scale to reach the battleground, while Turkish forces shot at them from the top of the cliffs, killing numerous men. We also lost a huge amount of men during the months of combat. When we retreated from Gallipoli, however, not a single man was lost. Our battalion completely credits our success to our captain, Mr. A.J. Shout. We left at the dead of night and were completely silent. For months before the evacuation, we had silent stunts to accustom the Turkish forces to lessened artillery fire. We even evacuated over 3 stages, spanning over a month. By cleverly tricking the Turkish forces, we managed to safely evacuate all 41,000 Anzacs with no casualties. I consider this the reason Australia still remembers and honours the Gallipoli battle as a valuable part of our nation's history.
That's an excellent answer. Thank you for your insight, sir. Now, you talked about your captain directing you and giving you orders. Could you explain to our viewers your army rank and the meanings of these rankings?
I started out as a private, as all new army recruits do. Privates are considered the force and manpower of the army. After 26 months of service, I was promoted to corporal. With this came the responsibility of leading a small team in my battalion, individual training, and ensuring the cleanliness and personal appearance of my soldiers. Beyond corporal are the positions of sergeant, lieutenant, captain, and major. With each of these comes added responsibility, respect, and duties.
That's all very complex. Thanks for sharing that with me and our viewers. Now, I've heard a lot about trench conditions in World War I. Could you give us your insight into this?
You've heard right, the trenches were very difficult to live in. They were dirty and they flooded during wet weather. They were often infested with rats and lice, which would eat our food and bite us when we slept. The lice affected us badly as they gave us what we nicknamed the trench fever, which resulted in terrible itching and a fever. Also, because our trenches were so muddy and wet, many soldiers suffered from what we called trench foot. This was the result of months of sustained exposure to the wet and muddy conditions in the trenches, caused by rain and bad weather. Trench foot sometimes resulted in foot amputation. There were wooden boards at the bottom of the trenches to try and prevent this, but they didn't provide much protection. Cold weather was an issue as well, because we had very limited blankets, jumpers, access to fire, or other means of warmth. Soldiers often lost fingers or toes to frostbite, in extreme cases even dying from cold exposure. The trenches themselves were dug in zigzagging patterns with many different levels, and were often reinforced with sandbags, wooden beams, and barbed wires. They were up to 3 metres deep and 2 metres wide, and were dug by resting and off-duty soldiers. It was very difficult for us soldiers to sleep in the trenches because of the constant wetness, noise, and uncomfortable surroundings. We were often overtired and in danger of falling asleep, which is why night watches were kept to 2 hours. I personally found living in the trenches very difficult. It was one of the most difficult aspects of war for me, living in constant fear of being raided by the enemy, and being constantly tired and uncomfortable was very hard on myself and the rest of my battalion, and it was a real test of courage and willpower.
Those sound like rough conditions to live in. It's incredible to think that men like yourself lived in those conditions for months, years at a time. So, when you were talking about your involvement in war, you mentioned being wounded in battle in Pozieres in July 1916. Could you expand on this for our viewers?
I was wounded in action during the Battle of Pozieres. I suffered 28 bullet wounds to my torso and legs at Bulcourt, requiring a prolonged hospitalisation period for treatment, and I was sent off to the Norfolk and Norwich War Hospital in England before returning to service in February 1917. During the First World War, casualties had to be taken from the field of battle to places where doctors and nurses could treat them. We were collected by stretcher bearers and moved to a location where treatment for our specific injury would take place. Where our soldiers ended up depended largely on the severity of our wounds. Owing to the number of the wounded, hospitals were set up in any available buildings. Often, casualty clearing stations were set up in tents. Surgery was often performed at these tents. Arms and legs were amputated and wounds were operated on. Wounds to the extremities were so severe that many thousands of soldiers had to have limbs amputated. In France, a guillotine from the French Revolution was used to amputate limbs. As traumatic as it was, amputation saved the lives of many men as it often prevented infection. Infection was a serious complication for wounded soldiers. Doctors used all the chemical weaponry in their arsenal to prevent infection. As there were no antibiotics or sulfamides, severe alternative methods were employed. The practice of debridement, where the tissue around the wound was cut away and the wound sealed, was a common way to prevent infection. Carbolic lotion was used to wash wounds, which were then wrapped in gauze soaked in the same solution.
That's all very interesting. I had no idea of the difficulties of injured soldiers. Now, you've been a bit quiet about this, but I've done some research and I came to understand that you had the honour of receiving a Victoria's Cross. Could you tell me and our viewers a bit more about this?
That's true, and what an honour it was. I earned my Victoria's Cross at the Bulcourt in May 1917, becoming the third member of my battalion to earn the award. The Victoria's Cross is the highest award of the United Kingdom honours system. It's awarded for gallantry in the face of the enemy to members of the British Armed Forces. I was incredibly honoured to receive mine. I earned it when I, on my own initiative, single-handed and exposed to heavy bomb and rifle fire, climbed on top of my parapet and proceeded to bomb the enemy, pressing them back along the trench. Having exhausted my stock of bombs, I continued to attack the enemy with my bayonet. I was then severely wounded. This was witnessed by the whole battalion and greatly inspired them in subsequent counterattacks. It is undoubtedly one of the most proudest moments of my life. But when I was there, I didn't feel very heroic. I was terribly frightened and acting for my battalion instead of myself. I had only recently returned from being injured in July, and then I was again sent off to the makeshift hospital for treatment. But yes, receiving my Victoria's Cross was an incredibly proud and humbling experience for me.
I can imagine. It must have been incredible. So, Mr. Howell, clearly you saw lots of horrific things during your time serving our country in World War I. Can you explain to me and our viewers how your perceptions of war changed from before you went to war to after you returned home?
Well, before World War I and most other Australians considered war to be this glorious, heroic thing. I and many of my friends enlisted as soon as we could. Some men even tried to enlist before they were old enough to, because the glory of going to war outweighed anything and everything that could happen when we were fighting. Needless to say, we were wrong. None of us, me included, expected the horrors of war we experienced. Killing another man killed a part of me. To know that I was the reason for the death of someone's son, father, husband, friend was incredibly difficult for me to deal with. My brother, William, was killed in action and I was beyond devastated. I only found out he died months after, by a letter delivered to me. I didn't even see his grave. To know that I caused the same pain to another family. It didn't even really occur to us all back home when we enlisted that we wouldn't be coming back. I can now see war for what it is, pointless. There's no reason for all those men to die in World War I, yet the honour of serving your country remains. Despite all the terrible things that happened during World War I was still proud to have served my country. I was even serving in World War II.
Wow, that must have been incredibly difficult for you. To know what war is like and to go back is truly heroic and brave. So, why did you enlist in World War II, and what was your life like after the war?
When I got back from war, I found it incredibly difficult to deal with things I'd seen and done. I suffered major PTSD, which was then known as shell shock. Basically, I couldn't stop reliving and thinking about my experience from war. I was overly alert and often couldn't sleep or eat for days at a time. But it wasn't all bad. On March 1919, I married my wife, Sadie Lillian Yates, at St. Stephen's Church in Sydney. We actually met during the war. She was one of the nurses who treated me when I was wounded in action. We settled in Coogee, where I was employed on the advertising staff of Smith's newspapers and later the Bulletin newspapers. At the outbreak of the Second World War, I enlisted in the Australian Army on the 14th of October, 1939. I was posted to Eastern Command Headquarters, Paddington, and was granted the rank of Staff Sergeant. In August 1944, I enlisted in the United States Army for the service in the United States Sea Transport Service. I lived in Sydney until 1956 when my wife died. I was deeply saddened, so I moved to Perth, which is where I've been living with my grandson ever since. While going to the war shook me and gave me a lot of trauma into the future, I don't regret serving my country. It was amazing to be able to serve my country. It was a very humbling experience. It also gave me an amazing perspective onto the world around me.
That's truly incredible. You really are one of Australia's finest war heroes. Well, that concludes today's interview. Thank you so much for joining me today, Mr. Howell. You have given me and our viewers a valuable insight into life at World War I.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for watching. I'll be back tomorrow with more interviews. Good night.